Guys, thank you so much for coming here. I got introduced to Andrew through the Long Island Reef Association. Andrew has been having these events at his house, and we decided, why don't we kind of go big and bring some amazing people to have a panel discussion. We don't usually see stuff like this. This is more probably like the old school MACNA, some folks have said, and I would agree with that, where you bring folks with so much great information in one place.
It's an honor to have you guys, and I'm going to pass the baton to the last aquarist of the year.
Yep, the last one, no more Magnus. Yeah, we joked about that coming up. I said, Sanjay, you've been nominating me for 10 years to be this. I appreciate you got me the last one, because that literally means I'm the aquarist of the year forever. So the one thing, Rashid gave a great introduction. The one thing he forgot to mention is, what we also want to do today is have fun. And sadly, I think a lot of the hobbyists have missed the biggest attribute. The main reason I've done this and been in this so long is try to have fun doing this. This shouldn't be a cutthroat enterprise. You shouldn't be online flaming each other. Everybody has a difference of opinion. Sanjay and I have been fighting each other for 35 years. But we always do it with respect at the end of the day, because we both know each other is right to some extent, and we always learn from each other. And I think if we have fun and respect and appreciate each other, it goes a lot farther. So I'm your moderator for today. So I'm going to try to keep things light and fun and try to make this informative and as enjoyable as we can. We're not going to sit here and just read off nonsense. We're going to talk about people's experiences and how it can help us in the hobby. So the first question I have is for the three heavy hitters, Joe and Thein and Andrew. You all have really large systems or manage large amounts of water. And since this is a topic or a discussion of water chemistry, you've also had small tanks. Do you find managing the water chemistry in a big tank is significantly different than managing it in a small tank that most of us are used to? And if so, how? Go ahead.
I'll jump
Joe,
in.
why don't you go first?
So, the reef tank out at Long Island Aquarium is a little over 20,000 gallons. It was built, opened in June of 2000. It was the largest reef tank in this hemisphere and second largest in the world at the time. So when you're talking about managing parameters in smaller tanks versus bigger tanks, a bigger tank is more like you're steering a freighter. And you have a common line. You want to stay pretty much on track on this line. You're going to go off of it, but it's more nudging. So it's just, as it drifts a little bit, you don't want it to drift too far, because a bigger tank is going to take that much more to bring that ship back on course. And then it can swing too far, of course, this way. So you really want to stay on top of the bigger tanks. And it is applicable towards smaller tanks also, but I just try to find a middle line and just try and stay just gentle nudges tends to be, versus much easier to correct a smaller volume, but also much easier for that volume to go even off kilter too.
So let's see, Tidal Gardens is probably somewhere in the ballpark, let's say, of 15 to 17,000 gallons total. We've gone through bouts of really bad water chemistry just from lack of testing and not caring whatsoever. So at different times, I think that our alkalinity has dropped down to like 3 DKH before, and we're still growing SPS. So we don't necessarily always obsess about water chemistry, but these days we are actively testing quite a lot more. And our goal with that is just to keep stuff as consistent as possible. Even if the numbers aren't ideal saltwater, reef to reef, guidelines, the consistency is like the most important thing for us, because oftentimes I think that the test kits and the testing tools that we have aren't necessarily the best. And so we're kind of like leveraging more on things like just how often are we calibrating the things that we're using to test. So I try very hard to not like hit specific numbers, but just keeping your bad numbers going for long enough is probably going to do you better than trying to chase anything. So again, stability above all, and then tweak it a little bit if you want, but for us, corals are highly adaptable, and I wouldn't worry about it super duper much, I guess.
The key word that he used also, which I use often too, is chase. Don't chase a number, right? So a lot of people chase numbers. They're using something digital. They think that because it's digital, it's accurate versus just a regular test kit. But yeah, don't chase numbers, because some of the numbers you might be chasing are wrong.
Right. As far as the size of the tanks, like that was a great analogy about the freighter, how it slowly changes. Well, the opposite is true. If you have a very small nano, and this really gets into like surface area of coral to water volume.
Right.
If you have a small nano, it's like you're in a little Boston whaler with a 200 horsepower engine. The slightest thing, like, whoa, you're off. So, you know, in those situations, maybe water changes might be a more stable way of handling that rather than to try to dose. Not that it can't be done, it's just you have to be more vigilant what you're doing.
Yeah, I think the water volume is to our benefit from the stability standpoint.
Yeah.
And I'll just give you some examples, okay? How many of you use GFO and like strip your phosphates and all of a sudden the aqua bleach the next morning or two, right? Mm-hmm. Or you test and the alk is down the next morning too, sometimes from GFO. Mm-hmm. It doesn't, like, when we change GFO, we change 10 buckets of rower here. I don't get those changes. My phosphate goes from like 0.12 to 0.08, and then it just stays there again. We've had our dosers by accident. We dose a special part 1 solution from Bob called carbonate buffer, liquid carbonate buffer. I think it's set for 100 mils every 24 hours.
That's to compensate for the alkalinity that you're losing from the sulfur reactor.
Right.
Where you're not losing calcium, but you're only losing alkalinity.
Correct. And we've had that thing like not plugged in for the night or for the day and looked at it and said, oh my God, we better go test the alkalinity. And it goes from 8.1 to 8. Like it just doesn't budge. So my answer is definitely, I'd put whether or not we should put a coral in here because the fish are reef safe or not reef safe, I would much rather take a sensitive coral, clean, quarantined, and put it in this water. I trust this water more than any other system in my house.
If you want to deep dive the numbers on that whole thing about water volume versus reef surface area of corals, Craig Bingman, I think, gave a presentation at a MAC. I don't know if it's in writing anywhere. He actually calculated it. He calculated the exact surface area of the corals and the volume of water, and then he showed how that can change, how the alkalinity, calcium depletion can occur. If anybody wanted to deep dive that, try to search that out. It's pretty interesting.
By the way,
we don't think about it too much.
In those 250s in the back, in the lab, and those vats that you saw, we do all the water changes from this tank. I only have to know one parameter. And we change it like every 3-4 days right now.
Andrew, how did I start my system up?
My water.
It's like natural ocean water.
Now, as a follow-up to that, you mentioned it stays pretty stable, and there's a lot of debate right now whether we need water changes, just add trace elements, whatever. I'm assuming on big tanks like this, you still do water changes. Are you doing them? How often? And how are you matching the water in your water change with the water here so that you aren't constantly juggling plates on a stick?
Right.
Whoever wants to take it, Joe.
Okay, I'll start on this then. So I do some water changes. It really varies. Sometimes it's nothing per week. Sometimes it's 5%, 10% a week. So 10% is 2,000 gallons. These numbers still freak me out after 23 years. But we are using natural seawater that's been mechanically filtered, and it's low in everything reef related. So it's got its disadvantages, but by doing a smaller volume, the tank easily compensates with the regular dosing. So combination thereof, because we've got sand filters on these tanks, so we're backwashing them with either the tank water or municipal water as well. So Yeah, I don't really worry too much about what I'm changing my water with, but it's good enough, right? The corals are like, it's fine. So I don't get too crazy with supplementing the new water to match what's going on in my tank. And sometimes I will do a 15% water change, and that's, it's my tank's about 200 gallons per inch. So every inch of water I take out is about 200 gallons. So
if I can interject for 1 second, before we get to Sarah and how she handles her water at her store,
Right.
Jane, I want you to do the summarized version of the water situation at Tidal Gardens.
I was going to ask him about that with the rainwater rather than.
That was
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, Thein,
Should we
watching
do
your
that?
video and seeing that you do a rather unique way of capturing water, for lack of a better term. Will you explain what you do with and how you prepare your water for water changes?
Sure.
And why?
Okay, so the new building that we have, it was started maybe 3-4 years ago. I always had this idea to collect rainwater and use that primarily to make our salt water, our RO, and then into salt water. So rain comes off the roof, we store it underground in a 10,000 gallon collection cistern that we are trying to expand to about 30,000 gallons, because even when you do the math about like the rainfall in Ohio for the entire year, it turns out that there's about like a dozen, half dozen to a dozen really strong rainfalls to make up that. It doesn't just like evenly trickle the whole year. So when it rains hard, we want to collect as much as we can. That conversation with the plumber has gone on for 3 years now. Anyway, we collect it down there, and in order to use rainwater that's been collected like that, it has a very high bacterial load that fluctuates throughout the year. In the summer, a lot more bacteria down there, less so in the winter, but you need to control the bacteria before you send it into your RO, because that bacteria will eat your RO membrane. So when it comes into the building, we have to put it through a chlorine stage to disinfect it. Then we have to dechlorinate it so that the chlorine itself doesn't eat the RO membrane. And then we have to run it through a 1 micron filter to hard filter out certain creepy crawlies that survive the chlorine bath that will also eat the RO membrane. So then once we finally are actually able to get RO, we store it in a 1,000 gallon container, and we then have another 1,000 gallon container to make the salt water. And just to make our lives easier, we had plumbed in variable speed drive pumps that pressurize lines, and those lines go to both of our buildings that have aquariums, and we have on-demand access to both fresh and salt water at 60 psi. So that's a pretty cool little system. As far as like whether or not water changes or zero water changes, whichever like methodology we're really trying to go for, that's kind of been a thing that ever since I've been in the hobby has been a discussion point. And I've always been a much bigger advocate for doing water changes, and purely from anecdotal experience, that when we do more water changes, things just look better, and purely based on that, nothing even theoretical. It always seems to improve the situation. So we run, I would say that we go through maybe 2,000 gallons a week of water changes, something along those lines, in that ballpark. And we do occasionally test our freshly made salt. We run like an ICP every now and again, just to see what the numbers are, just to make sure that we didn't have like a horrifically bad batch or something like that. But that's the I guess like the broad methodology that we go with.
I think we have to be careful when we think we can eliminate water changes just by maintaining the trace elements. Maybe we can, and that might vary from system to system. So there could be things we're not measuring, like not many people are measuring dissolved organic carbon in their water. And that may, in fact, in the aquaculture industry, that does have a bearing on what kinds of bacteria will grow in a tank. So you hear stories where people will have, RTN or something like this. And I know way back in the day when it kind of first hit the hobby, people were like panicking, and I can remember the late Greg Scheimer, fantastic hobbyist, who just did 20% water changes per day for 5 days, and he stopped it. So, like, why did that happen? Was he just replacing trace elements, or was he doing something with the water that we don't know yet? Well, we don't know yet. So, you know, it could be that using ozone allows you to get away from water changes because you're dealing with the organics better, or any other oxidizing methods out there, activated carbon. So this is, I think, where we're at, and there's a kind of a crossroads here, and it's pretty exciting to see where that all leads.
Well, I can say from my store, it has a total volume of 2,000 gallons. We're about 1,000 square feet, and we're in a very old building, very little air filtration. So for my store and for me, you know, most of the customers that shop at my store are either in the hobby 6 months or less, or they are hobbyists who have less than, say, 30 minutes a day to dedicate to their tank maintenance. So for me, water changes are crucial. When you're a new hobbyist and you don't understand magnesium and you don't understand potassium and you're not really sure what the nitrogen cycle actually is, water changes, in my opinion, are the key tool to be successful. I love when I see my customers come in and we go from talking about, hey, have you checked your alkalinity? And them going, you know, my what? And developing that relationship to where we talk about water changes can be worked out. When your system becomes established and you understand the relationship that you have with the corals that you've stocked, we can work ourselves out of that. Unless you want to have a 60-gallon SPS tank like I do and dump all PoloReef in it every single day. You know, so for the grassroots level hobbyist, water changes are, in my humble opinion, the most crucial part to instill that they have a tool accessible to them at any time to improve the quality of their tank, because they may not have a Hanna tester. They may only have dip strips. I cannot tell you how many people manage their 125-gallon saltwater tank on dip strips. So, you know, I think like in a system like this, or, you know, working at a large aquarium, I could see where understanding that chemistry would make it so that water changes might actually be a little traumatic if you get a little wild. But where we're at, it is our first step to give people empowerment to feel like you actually can impact the lives and the qualities of these corals. And you don't have to be a scientist. You just be diligent.
Okay, so I guess I'm a little bit right in the middle of this debate. We have a sand filter. We have the backwash. I'd say at least 1,000 to 2,000 gallons every 10 days would be that backwash. Then I told you we're doing water changes from this tank into the other systems. So we think we're doing more or less, we're taking out 3,000 gallons, 3,000 gallons a week, which is 10%. So I'm doing them. The issues have always been, are you fighting water chemistry? Did you fluff your salt up so much in certain elements or whatever that you're diluting it again by doing the water change? It depends on how much you rely on your salt. I happen to be lucky enough that this man right here customizes salt for me so that I'm not fighting this battle anymore.
And I'm lucky enough to have your discretion
you can explain to that.
of sending ICPs out every week and to all different companies and giving that feedback to me. So I've actually tweaked the salt for everybody.
The whole hobby will benefit.
To bring certain levels up, you know, to where we might want to see them on an ICP with being very careful not to put too much, which is a thing. That's the danger of chasing the trace elements. If the test is off, you could be overdosing and not realize it.
So,
But Andrew's doing so many tests that we're getting a nice handle on.
but even when Joe says, you know, you want to stay on that path and not like over drift. If there's a correction that says I need 3,000 mils of fluoride to bring it up to where I want it, there's a good chance I'm stopping at 1,500 and sending an ICP test in first, and not going all the way to 3,000 over the 10-day period.
Right.
So you just want to head the right direction and not turn too fast.
Right.
Putting my own 2 cents into that, I've actually run experiments because my goal in this is always tinkering and trying new things. And as Sanjay would tell you, don't follow what I do because I'm always experimenting. He stays straight and narrow, I'm always tinkering. But in terms of water changes, I've literally gone a year without doing a water change, and then I've gone to weekly water changes, and I've gone to bi-weekly water changes. And in my experience, what I have found is I do 10% every 2 weeks. And the two things that I have learned is for particularly, I don't have a tank like this, obviously, but I have a tanks our normal size for us. And in those tanks, I found two things are crucial. One, I try to match the new salt water in with the salt water I'm taking out. Because when you take out 10%, and if you're off by 20% or 30% in one of your trace elements, or not your trace elements, but alkalinity or calcium, it can have a dramatic effect on the tank. So I try to balance those. The other thing I now do, I used to be in a rush when I did a water change. And as soon as the water was out, the new water went back in because I didn't plan the system right. So when I did the water change, the coral sat in dry air for as long as it took me to do the tank. Fortunately, having learned the hard way that this was probably not the smartest thing to do, I now can do a water change. The water level drops below the level of the corals, and now I take 4 or 5 hours for the new water to flow back into the system. By doing so, I've reduced the shock down. Because how many times have you done a water change and you're going, this was bad, the corals are all stressing out, there's slime everywhere. That's what I used to get when I rushed and did it that way. Now that I do it over 5 or 6 hours, it's a lot more gradual, and the corals it gets diluted with the tank water as it passes through the sump. So this is just something I've learned after doing this for 40 years.
Yep.
Just quick chemistry perspective on fish. Fish are ammonia generators. They take your food that you put in, and they very efficiently, through oxygen that they're breathing in, convert it to ammonia, which they breathe out of their gills. So and ammonia is the preferred nutrient for corals, more than nitrate. They can use nitrate, but it takes more energy. Ammonia is just perfect, which is what happens on a natural reef. There's so many fish around the corals. So that's something to think about with fish, because some of the best reef tanks I've seen kind of had quite a few fish in them. And I know, Andrew, you talked once about, can we come up with a way of starting a reef without fish? That would require, looking at certain ammonia additives and things. I think if you really wanted to do it right.
This was a can you quarantine the fish last instead of first, and essentially keep the corals going, and what you would have to dose in order to do that. But the more I thought about even dosing phosphates, you're not dosing maybe organic phosphate, right? I think I don't know if it works so well.
It would be an interesting test.
Yeah.
And the fish feces contain super high levels of trace elements.
Right.
If they go through a circulation pump and your corals are eating that, that's another delivery method of trace elements, which is another whole discussion. Where corals get trace elements from.
Watching you feed the fish, you basically feed them 3 pounds of 4 pounds of
Right.
food a day, and it looks like most of it is protein. And you've also said at times you've had phosphate problems. Have you thought of shifting it over to a more plant-based food for the fish? And Joe, or do you use a more of a plant-based rather than a protein-based?
What does that mean? Like more nori?
Protein would give you more nitrogen, more nitrate. Protein would give you more nitrate. So the ratio of protein to phosphate in the food, some people I've talked to are like actually controlling their balance depending on the type of food.
By feeding more veggies instead of.
Well, veggies would actually probably raise the phosphate and not contribute to nitrate because there's less protein. Or the opposite, have an animal protein.
I never changed the diet.
Okay.
If you look at the percent protein on the food, you can kind of get a gauge of how much.
The thing that brought me to the event today was just the collection of talent and knowledge that I saw on the panel. It was a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity at such an intimate event to Mike Paletta, Sanjay, Brandy, Thein, Yaullio. So the collection of knowledge and experience in the reefing hobby was the primary reason why I decided to attend today.
I will say there is tons of fishes in there, and I'm talking about wrasses, tangs, butterflies. But if I will say this, and he did point it out, that sweet lips is amazing. The yellow, the black, everything about it, it's like, its profile, it's very charismatic fish, and it's got tons of personality. I love that fish, actually. I'm really kind of investing in trying to see if I want to get one for my own tank.
It's always amazing when I come over here. Just always something new when I come over. So Drew is a master of the hobby, per se. And it just amazes me with the ideas that he comes up with. You know, the first time I came here, there was barely any coral in the 17,000 gallon, and just from to see where 2 years ago and the first time Drew had me over to where the tank now is, and even the back room is just amazing. You know, it's a laboratory now where before it was, you know, some little wood here and there and a wood table and some, you know, maybe some 2x4s here and there. So it's definitely come a long way.